The wagon hit the rut so hard it threw her sideways into the sideboards, and by the time Edie got her hands up to catch herself, the door was already open and the ground was coming up fast. She didn't scream. There wasn't time. The red dirt of the Kansas plain came up and swallowed her whole. She lay still for a long moment, face pressed into the earth, listening to the sound of hooves fading west. The driver hadn't stopped. She wasn't sure he'd even noticed, or maybe he had. And that was the point. Maybe that had been the point all along. Leave the widow from Cincinnati on a cattle road, 6 miles from the nearest town, with nothing but the dress she was wearing, and the $2 she'd sewn into the hem of her skirt. Edie pushed herself up onto her hands and knees. The prairie stretched out in every direction, brown and flat and indifferent. The sky above was the pale white of a fish belly. Somewhere to the north, dark clouds were building along the horizon, slow and deliberate, the way trouble always came when you couldn't afford it. She stood. Her left wrist throbbed where she'd caught herself on the fall. She turned it slowly, testing. Not broken. That was something. She looked down the road, then up the road, then off into the grass, where a hawk was circling something dead. She started walking north. She didn't know why north. There was no good reason. But the clouds were there, and somehow the idea of walking towards something, even something dark, felt better than walking away from nothing. The storm caught her in 3 hours. It came in low and sideways, the kind of rain that doesn't fall so much as arrive, all at once, horizontal, full of cold intent. Edie had managed to get herself off the road, and into a shallow gully by then, which offered nothing in the way of shelter, but at least kept her from being standing upright in open ground when the lightning started. She crouched with her back against the clay bank, and her knees pulled to her chest, and she thought about her husband, Marcus, who had been dead 11 months, and whose creditors had arrived at the house in Cincinnati 7 weeks after the funeral with paperwork she didn't understand. And a disposition she did. She thought about the lawyer, who had smiled at her, the way men smiled at women. They didn't take seriously. She thought about the house, the furniture, the clock on the mantel that had belonged to her mother. Then she stopped thinking about any of it, because thinking about it didn't keep the rain off her, and she had learned in 11 months that grief was a luxury she couldn't carry and still move forward. She was still crouched in the gully when she heard the horse. It came from the east, picking its way down, knew the terrain with the careful gait of an animal that knew the terrain. Edie pressed herself back against the clay and stayed very still, the way she'd learned to stay still. In the weeks after the creditors came, when stillness felt like the only form of control she had left. The horse stopped at the edge of the gully. The man on it looked down at her without expression. He was large, not just tall but broad through the shoulders, in a way that made the horse beneath him look reasonable in size. He wore a canvas coat that had gone grey with weather and use, and a hat with a brim that shed the rain in a steady curtain around his face. He had a beard that had grown past intention into something else, and eyes that were neither kind nor cruel, just watchful the way eyes got when they'd spent a long time looking at things from a distance. He said nothing for what felt like a full minute. Then, "You hurt?" Edie's jaw was tight from the cold. She made herself unclench it. No. He looked at her wrist. She hadn't noticed she was holding it against her chest. "That's not nothing," he said. "It's fine." He studied her a moment longer, the way a man studies a problem he didn't ask for and isn't sure he wants. Then he swung down off the horse in a single motion and crouched at the edge of the gully with his forearms on his knees, which brought him closer to eye level with her and made the space feel somehow smaller. "Storm's going to get worse before it gets better," he said. "I've got a cabin 2 miles up the ridge. You can shelter there till it passes." "I don't know you." "No," he agreed. "You don't." He stood back up and offered her his hand. Not insisting, just offering. Edie looked at his hand for a long moment. She thought about all the times she'd taken the hand a man offered and what it had cost her. Then she thought about the clay gully and the lightning getting closer and the temperature dropping, and she took it. His name was Wren. He didn't offer more than that, and she didn't ask. He helped her up onto the horse behind him, and they rode in silence up the ridge, while the storm shook the grass flat on either side of the trail. The cabin materialized out of the rain like something that had been waiting for them. Low-built, solid, chinked tight against the weather, with a lean-to on the north side where he kept the horse. Inside, it smelled like wood smoke and pine resin and something animal she couldn't name. He got the fire going without ceremony. She stood near it and tried not to drip too much on his floor. "Sit," he said, nodding at the chair nearest the hearth. She sat. He brought her a cloth for her wrist and a tin cup of water heated on the stovetop, and he set them on the table beside her without making it into something. That was the first thing she noticed about him, really noticed. That he didn't make things into something. He just did what needed doing and moved on to the next thing. There was no performance in it. She wrapped her wrist herself. He didn't hover. "Where were you headed?" he asked from across the room. He was at the window, watching the storm. "Abilene," she said. There was a woman there who said she had work, correspondence for a land office." He didn't say anything to that. "The driver of the wagon was supposed to take me to the junction," she continued, though she wasn't sure why she was explaining herself to a stranger. Old habit. Women explained. "He went the wrong way." Or, "I don't think it was the wrong way." Wren turned from the window. He looked at her steadily. She blinked. "That was his name. You know him?" "I know of him." He didn't elaborate. His jaw had gone tight in a way she recognized. Not anger exactly, but the controlled version of it, the kind men kept locked behind their back teeth. "Is the road to Abilene far from here?" she asked. "Yes." She waited for more. It didn't come. "How far?" 60 miles. Mud. He paused. "Storm like this will be followed by mud. Road won't be passable for 3-4 days at least." Edie looked at the fire. 3 or 4 days. She turned the math over. She had $2 in her hem, and no food, and a wrist that had begun to swell, despite the wrapping. She had nowhere to go until the mud dried, and even then, she'd have to find another way to get there. Because she had no horse, and no wagon, and no money for either, she said very carefully, "I'd like to work for the shelter while the road dries. I can cook. I can clean. I can do whatever needs doing around the property." Wren looked at her for a long moment. "I don't need a cook," he said. "Then tell me what you need." Something shifted in his expression. Just slightly. He looked away from her, back toward the window, and she had the sense he was deciding something he hadn't planned to decide today. "The fence line on the south pasture is down in 3 places," he said finally. "I've been putting it off because I've been working the water line up on the ridge, and I can only be in one place. If the cattle get through the south fence before I have the water line sorted, I lose both problems at once. I can help with the fence." He looked back at her. Something in his face said he wasn't entirely sure she was serious. "I'm not asking for charity," she said. "I'm asking to be useful. Those are different things." The silence stretched. Outside, the storm hammered the roof. 3 days, he said. "Fence first, then whatever else needs doing. When the road's passable, I'll take you to the junction myself." "That's fair," she said. He nodded once and went back to the window, and that was that. She slept on the cot near the fire, under a blanket he left folded on the table, without saying anything about it, and in the morning she woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of him already outside in the grey pre-dawn, moving around the lean-to. The fence work was harder than she'd let on she expected it to be. The posts had heaved in the wet ground, and her hands weren't built for the pliers, but she made them work. She made a lot of things work that week that she hadn't known she could. She made herself learn to read the tension in a wire, the way Wren showed her, 2 hands, 1 steady pull. She made herself not flinch when the barbs caught her palms. She made herself eat the hard bread and the salt pork he put on the table for breakfast Without wishing, it was something else. Wren worked beside her mostly in silence. Occasionally he would correct something. The angle she was driving a staple, the way she was holding the wire stretcher, and he corrected it by showing, rather than telling, which she found she preferred. He had no patience for things done halfway, but he also didn't expect things done perfectly by someone who'd never done them before. He expected things done honestly. She could see the distinction in him, the fine line between demanding and fair, and she respected it even when her shoulders ached and her palms were cut. On the second afternoon, a coyote came at the calves, along the east edge of the pasture. Wren was at the far end of the fence line. Edie was closer. She didn't think. She grabbed the fence post she'd been holding, and she ran toward it, shouting, waving the post in a way that probably looked ridiculous. The coyote startled and bolted. The calves pressed together and bawled. She stood there breathing hard, post in hand, her heart going fast. When she turned around, Wren was watching from 20 yards away. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, that was either very brave or very stupid. The calves were scared, she said. So was the coyote. Difference is the coyote will come back. Then we should fix the section of fence near the east draw. Another silence, but something in the silence was different from the silences at the beginning. This one had something in it she couldn't name, not warmth exactly, just less cold. Yes, he said, we should. The nights were the strangest part. He didn't talk much, but in the evenings, after the work was done, and the fire was banked, and they'd eaten whatever she'd managed to put together from his sparse supplies, there was a quality of quiet between them that she hadn't expected. Not uncomfortable, not familiar either, something in between. The quiet of two people who have worked hard at the same thing and don't need to narrate it. She found out in pieces that he'd been on this land for 8 years, that he'd come from Missouri originally, that he'd had a brother who died of a fever in the 3rd year, and that was when he'd stopped going into town. More than he needed to. He didn't say any of this as a confession or an explanation. He said it the way he did everything, plainly, without fuss, as if the facts were just facts and didn't require decoration. She told him about Marcus. Not everything, just the shape of it, the marriage, the business, the debts she hadn't known about, the way the house had emptied out around her like water draining from a tub. 11 months, she said, and was surprised to hear herself say it aloud. People say it gets easier. Does it? I don't know yet. She looked at her hands on the table. I think maybe it gets quieter. That's not the same thing. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, no, it's not. And somehow that was better than all the things people had said to her that were supposed to help. On the 3rd evening he told her about the water line, and she asked if she could see it. And the next morning he took her up the ridge before breakfast to show her the work he'd been doing. The pipe he'd sourced from a supplier in Salina, the grade he was working with, the spring he'd found 3 years ago that he'd been trying to get down to the house ever since. He explained it the way he explained everything, expecting her to follow, not condescending to make it simple, and she found herself following it, really following it. Standing on the ridge with her hands in her coat pockets and the early sun cutting sideways across the grassland and actually caring about where the water went. You'll have it done by fall? She asked. If the ground doesn't freeze early, what if it does? Then spring. She nodded. The wind moved through the grass below them in a long, slow wave. It'll be worth it, she said, when it's done. He looked at her sideways. Yes, he said, and then looked back at the grassland, and there was something in that single syllable that she filed away without examining. The road dried on the 4th day. She knew it before he said anything, because the mud at the yard's edge had begun to firm up, and the ruts left by the storm were showing crust at the edges. She stood at the door of the cabin in the early morning and looked at it, and felt something complicated moving through her relief, and something else that wasn't relief, something she didn't have a clean word for, came out behind her. Road should be passable by afternoon, he said. No, yes, she said. I thought so. He stood beside her, and they looked at the yard for a moment. The horse was at the fence of the lean-to, pulling at the hay. One of the calves had gotten up near the gate again, curious about nothing in particular. I'll hitch the wagon after the morning's work, he said. All right. But she didn't move from the doorway, and neither did he, and the morning light came down through the thin clouds and settled on the grass, and she thought about Cincinnati. She thought about the land office in Abilene. She thought about the letter she'd received from a woman named Mrs. Harlan, who'd said the work was steady, and the situation respectable, and the wage enough to board on. She thought about the water line on the ridge, the east fence that still needed 2 new corner posts in spring, the calves that would be yearlings by October. She thought about the quiet that had grown up between them like something planted. She turned to go back inside for her things. There wasn't much: the coat, the $2, the spare dress she'd washed in his basin and hung to dry on the line. It would take 5 minutes to gather. She got as far as the table. She stood there with her hand on the back of the chair she'd sat in every evening for 4 days, and she looked at the surface of the table, where they'd eaten in silence, and talked in small pieces, and left things unsaid that somehow still got communicated. She looked at the window above the wash basin where the light came in at a slant in the mornings, and made everything look slightly better than it was. She heard him come in behind her, and she didn't turn around. The wagon, she said. Yes, he said. But he didn't move toward the lean-to. She turned. He was standing in the doorway. He was looking at her the way he'd looked at the problem of the fence and the problem of the water line, seriously, without pretense, like something that mattered, and he wasn't going to pretend otherwise. The east corner posts, she said. Cedars, he said, for the rot, and the coyote's going to come back. He will. She took her hand off the back of the chair. I could stay through spring, she said, until the water line's done, then decide. Something in Wren's face shifted. Not much, just at the edges. The way the light shifted on the grassland when the clouds moved, barely visible but there. That's a fair arrangement, he said. She nodded. He nodded. And that was how it was decided. Not with declarations, not with promises, but with the same plain exchange they'd used for everything else. A problem, a solution, 2 people who had figured out they could work in the same direction without getting in each other's way. She pulled the chair out and sat back down at the table. He crossed to the stove and put the kettle on. Outside, the calf was still at the gate. The grass moved in the easy way. It moved on good days when the wind was mild, and the sky was clear, and there was nothing bearing down on anyone for a little while. The spring was still up on the ridge, waiting to come down. The fence posts she'd driven were solid in the ground. The work they'd done was real, and it was there, and it would hold. She wrapped her hands around the tin cup when he set it in front of her, and the warmth of it moved up through her palms, and she did not think about Cincinnati. She did not think about the road to Abilene or the letter from Mrs. Harlan or the $2 still sewn into the hem of her skirt. She thought about what Wren had said on the ridge, standing in the early light with the whole of the grassland laid out below them. It'll be worth it when it's done. She thought he'd been talking about the water line. She wasn't sure now that he had been. Entirely. She wasn't sure she'd been talking about it either. She drank her coffee. He drank his. The kettle cooled on the stove, and out past the window, the Kansas morning opened up wide and unhurried, and gave them both whatever came next.